Okay, well, hello everybody. My name's Melissa Leach. I'm Director at IDS, and I'd like to welcome all our participants to this latest Sussex Development Lecture, those of you watching on Zoom and on YouTube. This is, of course, the latest in this series on COVID-19 and development, Building Back Better. And it's our series co-hosted by IDS, the School of Global Studies, the Science Policy Research Unit, and the Centre for International Education here in Sussex. And today's topic, I think, could not be more relevant. We're going to be exploring COVID-19 and development. And of course, we've seen uncertainties of many kinds pervading the unfolding of the pandemic and what might come next. It's been an escapable, though not always fully acknowledged theme, I think, in everything we've seen in science policy, in science advice, in what we've seen on the media. And what we want to do in this lecture is to pick up from COVID to explore a little bit more broadly why uncertainty is so important to politics today and what are the implications. Because I think whether we're talking about pandemics or other domains, finance, technology, climate change, migration and security, what the future holds for us all in today's world does feel increasingly uncertain. And I think what our speakers today want to explore is why this is and what alternative approaches are demanded. If, as we hope in this whole series, we're to realise much needed progressive change and transformation, then I think the suggestion is that current rather blinkered understandings of uncertainty aren't good enough. They need to be expanded and met with renewed democratic struggle and a different kind of politics. And we'll hear more about that. So I'm really delighted to welcome our two speakers. We're going to be hearing first from Andy Stirling, who is Professor of Science and Technology Policy at SPRU here in Sussex, and a well-known colleague and collaborator to many of us. He'll be in conversation with Sobia Ahmad Kaker, who's a lecturer at Goldsmiths in the Department of Sociology. And she is an interdisciplinary urban studies scholar, interested, as she puts it, in the everyday lived experiences of uncertainty. And in particular, Sobia works in cities in the global south, and most notably in Karachi. So there's a very nice link there with the lecture we had 2 weeks ago, where Nosheen was speaking about COVID in the context of Karachi, and we look more closely at cities and the urban context. So also just to note that the speakers are both co-authors, and Andy's a co-editor, along with Ian Scoons, of the very recently published book, The Politics of Uncertainty, Challenges of Transformation. And I think they'll be drawing on their contributions to the book in this lecture. So before I hand over to Andy, just a couple of quick housekeeping things. As usual, I'm very pleased to welcome Marco Nardi, who is English to British Sign Language interpreting this event. I'd invite you all to tweet it using the hashtags #SussexDev and Global Dev Trends. The lecture will, as usual, be available to watch after the event, both via YouTube and on the IDS website. And questions and comments, once we've heard from our speakers, will be very, very welcome. Please type your question either in the chat box in Zoom or the comments box on YouTube, and then we'll be selecting a selection which I will read out to address during the Q&A. So without further ado, over to you, Andy, and let's hear your opening, your provocations to us all.
Always dangerous to ask me to be provocative, but thanks, Melissa. Thanks for the introduction. And it's been one of the great privileges, actually, of my working career for the last 14 years, first with you, Melissa, initially, and then just with Ian Scoons, who you mentioned, to be co-directing this STEP Centre, this collaboration between IDS and SPRU, where I work. And when last year the STEP Centre set out to hold a symposium on the politics of uncertainties, we knew the issues were important and neglected, as you said, Melissa, but we never expected it to become quite so horribly topical as it has done. And arguably, even more now than ever before with the global pandemic, it's become really clear how deeply inconvenient uncertainty is to power, and how easily it can demolish even the most elite structures of privilege, and how especially starkly devastating uncertainty can be for people who are already vulnerable. So the book that came out of the symposium was published at the height of the first wave of the pandemic in the UK. It was a fairly giddying experience, and we were immensely lucky to attract in the book a really large and diverse range of authors with a huge experience from finance markets and technology to regulation and climate change, cities, with Sobia here, pandemics itself, and migration, security, resilience. So even before the pandemic, what emerged from all these areas across the board is that it was anyhow growing ever more clear that the future is increasingly uncertain, and as has been shown repeatedly, albeit briefly, sporadically in previous humbling crises like other diseases, outbreaks, disasters of various kinds, political mobilization, financial crashes, it's been shown the same kind of patterns played out, but more intensely, demolishing a whole series of comfortable platitudes that risk is measurable, as imagined in global regulatory regimes like the WTO, in fact, enforced by those regimes, that it be measured, that surprise can be neglected, like an insurance and liability cover for new technologies, which are crucially missing in certain respects, that expertise can definitively determine decisions, as in public health decisions over pandemics, like the one we're in, that models can be assumed to reflect reality, as has been punctured so repeatedly and embarrassingly in this pandemic, in some places more than others, and that's interesting in itself. And that policy can be based on evidence and nothing else, as is favored in these burgeoning institutions and practices and cultures of new public management around the world. So that the world can be controlled through science is the bottom line of this, which is an essentially, you could say, colonial imagination at the heart of different globalizing modernities around the world. All these things have been in play in front of our eyes nightly with the pandemic. You could say it's been leaving a kind of overbearing Emperor of Modernity newly visible in his lack of clothes. And all these tropes are not only comfortable to privilege, these tropes that have been so challenged in this experience and that we challenge in the book, but they're highly expedient to power, because it's by telling stories of control that overstate knowledge and downplay uncertainty that powerful interests maintain their privilege in a world that, as we are seeing, is actually deeply uncontrollable. So as in previous crises, but more intense now because of the scale, what this experience actually highlights is that it's as much action that shapes knowledge as knowledge that underpins action, and the uncertainties are not just about knowledge, but embodied in lived experience of race and class and gender, and that certainties are not some kind of bedrock, but they're actively constructed. Certainties are constructed by institutions, and that unlearning is just as important as learning, that trustworthiness is more salient than trust. And I guess finally, that recognition and access and accountability are the preconditions for robust governance more than expertise, and without which the kind of language of ethics and responsibility we hear so much of can just be reduced to etiquettes of patronage and rhetorics for claims making. All these things we pick up in the book, summarize in Ian and my initial chapter, and explore in fantastic form in the rich chapters that are through it. So it's really an emerging theme very strongly throughout the book, that these convenient stories of control have actually not worked so well, and that mutualism, more than hierarchy, is where the prospects of progressive transformation actually lie. So from this sort of global experience of enforced uncertainty then, in all these ways, what our book does anticipate, quite uncannily actually, inadvertently, to be emerging is what we call a newly invigorated politics of care. And it's on this base that Ian and I explored in our introduction what implications might arise, not only for possibilities, for new momentum, for progressive transformations, but fresh and more convivial imaginations of what progressive transformation even means, as well as how it can be achieved. So, of course, all this high-blown words, they beg more questions and answers. The book explores many of these, but it's really great. And I'm so happy to have this conversation now with Sobia, whose fantastic fieldwork over many years on urban insecurity and uncertainty, especially in Karachi, but also beyond, formed the focus of a key chapter in the book. So to get us kind of going, I just wanted to put a few points to Sobia, which you may want to take issue with or elaborate, Sobia, as you feel, about kind of questions about how you feel, how you find these ever-present conditions of uncertainty to impact in the everyday experience of precarity that's formed such a focus of your work, and what imperatives arise for you from this issues I just briefly batted around accountability and responsibility in this new kind of politics of care that we're struggling to define in the book. And finally, what's the practical upshot of all this for emancipating people by enacting progressive values around uncertainty that we bang on about, but there's a lot of work to do to really pin down. So those are a few provocations, Sobia, that it'd be great to hear you pick up on. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Andy, for your incisive introduction as well as overview. It's my pleasure to follow up on this from a more empirical perspective. So how do the politics of uncertainty impact everyday experiences of precarity? That's the first question or the first provocation that I'm sort of thinking of. I want to start by saying that uncertainty has long been studied as urban context in expanding global South cities, and that's the kind of space within which I do my work, where conditions of extreme vulnerability to exogenous shocks couple with limited state support. And these routinely push urban residents to situations where their futures do look uncertain. So following this academic tradition, I study how urban residents live through and manage everyday uncertainty related to insecurity in Karachi. I call this kind of uncertainty ordinary, particularly because it's not an outcome of any spectacular one-off occurrence like a terrorist attack, but instead it's an outcome of the routinization of insecurity, a situation where sort of criminal, political, and sectarian actors intermittently clash with each other or with state forces in violent encounters, all with different levels of intensity over a prolonged period of time. This form of insecurity doesn't render the urban sort of inactive or sort of dysfunctional. Everyday life continues to thrive in Karachi. It's one of, it's Pakistan's largest city. It has its largest or biggest contribution to the national GDP. It's a city known for its finance and industry. So, in this way, insecurity in Karachi kind of simmers under the surface until it peaks and then sort of fades away. It's a condition of order disorder, as a French academic, Laurent Guéa, puts it. So I guess we can say that ordinary uncertainty is a condition where uncertainty becomes certain. And this is not just something that is common to Karachi. It's also common to many cities in the world where they might be wrought by frequent disasters like earthquakes or violence and insecurity or conflict or sort of floods or hurricanes. It's a form of uncertainty that's governed at different scales. Governments may play a role, but individuals would have to act as well. And we could definitely relate our present experience with the coronavirus as a situation of ordinary uncertainty, especially since in the UK now, especially just before the situation of lockdown, but I think even since then, we've been encouraged to stay alert and stay safe while the government does some kind of framing around our own sort of, agency within this environment. So in the context of Karachi, in the absence of effective governmental guidance and trustworthy leadership, urban residents are left to govern their uncertainty themselves. They do this by speculative and anticipatory practices. And this is, again, something that we see in sort of techno-managerial speak, the language of speculation and anticipation. And I try to sort of, decolonize or colonize, let's think of these words, the speak and say, people adopt and appropriate these practices and, they have been doing so since time immemorial as well. So in Karachi, people read emergent events in relation to past trajectories. They accordingly imagine what this event might mean and how it might pan out over the next couple of hours or days, and then they structure and shape their actions in the present in line with that imagination or anticipation. They act anticipatorily by staying updated. Karachiites religiously follow news and information on the city's conditions relating to security, or halat, as we would say in Urdu. They share this with others in person, through routine interactions at sort of traffic lights, people poking their heads out of cars, speaking to the neighboring cars, or sort of at street corners, in shops, when they would encounter their neighbors on the street, just how people would discuss the weather over here. I guess it's, as unpredictable as security in Karachi, perhaps. And they would share this with others or in person through social media in the form of stories, rumors, images, or forwards. Many are members of Facebook and WhatsApp groups where they receive live updates on clashes or planned protests or riots in different parts of the city. And in this way, information and its exchange becomes a critical resource for Karachiites to navigate uncertainty. So sort of in my research, which I mentioned sort of in a little bit in the chapter that we wrote in the book that Ian and Andy edited, I look at information as a resource, and I try to study how it's created, communicated, and consumed. I trace the life cycle of a particular news story and social media posts in order to understand the social life and political impact of mediated, shared, and acted upon information. And in doing so, I trace the sources, the forms of communication, the kinds of sharing and resulting action. And it is quite revealing of the politics of precarity. For the majority, this kind of socially organized and collaboratively managed form of uncertainty governance does work well, but it also hugely magnifies existing inequalities in very different ways. So for example, in my research, I see how information sort of becomes a political resource that actors use to achieve personal or group advantages. What is shared with whom, to what extent, with what depth? Is it, what kind of official sources are leaking some information? Who's the first to know of it? Who's breaking a particular news to any other person? In this context, social relations of creating certainty themselves become a source of uncertainty, because this information becomes quite unruly at times and sort of, opaque. Anticipatory action also allows some social actors to reconfigure and reshape their social positions favorably, for sure. So, for example, if marginal groups or people sort of might collect some information, they feel that in sharing it, they may get some group advantages. But at the same time, they might be able to transcend their precarious position in the short term. But these actors are always acting under limited agency, and it's important to recognize that, especially as ordinary uncertainty doesn't allow them to transcend unequal power relations or dismantle oppressive structural regimes. So, what's the public outcome of this kind of individual emancipation? And in some cases, socio-technical infrastructures of information exchange are also very unequally structured. So it's also very important to bear that in mind. Access to electricity, smartphones, internet, phone balance, these are all very significant for receiving and sharing information through social media and technologies. The system may magnify existing precarity along the lines of race, ethnicity, class, gender, ability, disability, age. These are all significant in structuring inclusions or exclusions, just in the way that we see in the current pandemic and how it's sort of affecting individual sort of groups of people. So more importantly, we might celebrate this form of survival in Karachi by lauding Karachiites and others in similar contexts as being innovative and resilient. And this is something that we see in how sort of global South urbanism and its vibrancy is seen as is celebrated rather in policy circles as something that allows systems to work with minimal governmental sort of investment or public expenditure. But at the same time, it's important to consider that these kinds of uncertainty aren't catered to a public good. So they lack any commitment towards collective public interests. And to celebrate them, we can eventually or unintentionally work to make life even more uncertain for particular population groups. Just like what I said about rumors of false information, triggering fresh waves of violence, but also then who's responsible for maintaining some kind of broader order or structure, some kind of certainty. And I guess this kind of is a good segue to think about your second provocation, Andy, where you said that it's important to consider the politics of responsibility and thinking towards an ethics of care. So in Karachi, we observe how a lack of trust in official government sources of information pushes Karachiites to search for alternative sources. The resulting environment of suspicion is one where wild conspiracy theories are hatched and often taken more seriously than perhaps even truths that the governments might sort of come and say. And again, this reminds me of the current coronavirus crisis, where sort of, is the mask effective as a means of protecting oneself, or, is the whole virus a conspiracy, that the government has hatched to subjugate populations? I mean, these kinds of conspiracies are born in an environment where sort of governments start losing their legitimacy or trust. I mean, the eat out, help out, sort of how far is that, how far is it safe to eat out or help out? Or are we just doing it because we need to boost businesses? Should we trust the government there? So as a starting point, then I guess, trust does need to be fostered between public institutions or institutions governing uncertainty in society. And therefore, accountability is very important. So that's definitely one thing to think about. How can we think about a more just, sort of transparent, accountable sort of governance system, whether in the West or sort of elsewhere? It's also very important, I think, in this current environment, especially so much on governing uncertainty rests on the knowledge or information on which sort of actions or anticipatory actions are taken. So legibility of information, transparency of information is very important, especially in the current environment of fake news, or is it the post-truth environment, like however we want to frame it. These are interesting things to think about. And thirdly, to think of a sort of politics of care, public investment in societies is critical. We know that people come together at times of crisis. A strong community spirit is something to celebrate. But as I said earlier, it can encourage disinvestment in public resources, especially in the current environment of austerity politics. Governments should be held accountable to provide just leadership and social protection. And then I guess coming to advancing progressive values, like if we do think about sociality as being critical to governing uncertainty, then, maybe governments need to invest in sort of creating more socially egalitarian societies, to make meaningful commitments to equality and social justice, to build more inclusive societies. So these individual sort of forms of gaining, or, sort of thinking of opportunities, because in a lot of ways, these crises also open up spaces of opportunity for people in precarious groups, but also people in powerful groups. So in what way can we create a system whereby sort of people can benefit equally, regardless of class, age, race, or sort of ability? Meaningful investment in participatory systems of governance is also crucial. So digital technologies can be used to facilitate this in the form of meaningful citizen participation. But again, to make sure that this participation is egalitarian and sort of equally engaged as well. And perhaps most importantly, like sort of echoing a little bit what you said, Andy, sort of thinking of uncertainty as a starting point of unlearning the ways in which we do politics and the ways in which we think of power. It's not possible for governments to know everything. It's not possible for sort of techno-managerial ambitions of generating certainty to be actually the right way of going forward. Perhaps we could learn from sort of, other places where fate or sort of magic or religion or, sort of other cultures of knowledge, social cultures of knowledge production allow people to manage anxieties relating to uncertainty. I think that, especially in the current environment, like sort of a lot of us have been in a highly anxious state, particularly because we've been conditioned to believe that, these kinds of things can be governed, and the not knowing of, when things can get better, what it might mean, has been an incredibly disorienting experience. It also makes me think from a very personal perspective that perhaps I have become more British than Pakistani if I'm not able to sort of stay calm in this sort of environment of complete disorder, as I've seen my siblings or my parents or my friends and my family in Pakistan take it. Just sort of, they're just so used to all of these different things being out of control that this is just another one of them. We talk about it for 7 days. By next week, something new would have come up and we would have forgotten about it. So, I mean, I just sort of want to end on that note, and I look forward to any questions or comments you might have, Andy, Melissa, or anyone else.
Yeah, okay. Sobia, that's wonderful. And before we open up, I must just note that everything you've just said, and in fact, building on Andy's provocations as well, really rings true, certainly to the way I've experienced and with colleagues have actually been thinking about uncertainty in the context of epidemics, where actually one of the other chapters in the book is co-authored by myself and Hayley McGregor and Annie Wilkinson and Santiago Ripoll, where we actually do look in a pre-COVID moment at uncertainty around epidemics. And indeed with reflections on development more generally, where I think you've both highlighted incredibly well this really big gulf between the sort of techno-managerialism, or in the development context, it's often the sort of mainstream approach for top-down blueprint style planning, and the disjuncture with actually the ongoing realities on the ground, whereby people often living in situations of precarity just get on with it and are living with uncertainties in a very everyday way. So I think in our chapter, we call it everyday uncertainties. You've called it ordinary uncertainties. Yeah. So that really rings true. And I think you're absolutely right that there's a lot that the management of pandemics could learn, in fact, development more generally, from listening more closely to these everyday ways that people do deal with uncertainties. But I would like to hear a little bit more in the questions about what the alternative politics looks like, and perhaps what different kinds of knowledge or evidence might help us, by which one means a broader, in a sense, development community to navigate uncertainties. So maybe that's something that we can pick up on a little bit more in the discussion. But meanwhile, we're also beginning to get some comments and questions coming through on the chat. So please, people, do post your questions and we'll look at them. But while you're beginning to do that, I'm going to read out one here from Eric Millstone, which is particularly directed to Andy, but Sobia might want to pick it up as well. So Eric asks, this is Eric Millstone from Sprue, who says, I am persuaded about the importance of uncertainty and the ways in which incumbent authorities typically deny or ignore or discount uncertainties to maintain their claims to be in control, and that ordinary people can and do acknowledge and cope with uncertainties routinely in their lives. But, he goes on, when I try to comprehend the enthusiasm with which some people embrace ludicrous conspiracy theories about, for example, COVID, I'm attracted by the hypothesis that one reason why some people embrace those conspiracy theories is because they find it difficult or impossible to cope with overwhelming uncertainties. And so they assume that there's actually some underlying secret logic that explains everything, and that they're privileged to be in possession of vital secrets that most other people don't realize. So in brief, this is a question about, does the growing prevalence of conspiracy theories provide evidence that some people really can't cope with profound uncertainties? I think that's actually a very apt question. I'd love to hear what you have to say about that. Conspiracy theories around COVID. Just in the last few days, we've seen conspiracy theories about vaccines begin to proliferate, as we now see that particular technology being put forward as apparently a solution to the pandemic dilemma. So perhaps while other people are beginning to post their comments, maybe Andy, you'd have a go at the relationship between conspiracy theory and uncertainty.
Yes, sure. Yeah, it's a very well aimed question, actually. And to be honest, it's been quite challenging for someone of my own persuasions, dispositions to see this unfolding, this pandemic, because it is quite, if you take it seriously and you know, try and be self-critical, it is quite challenging. The point you've made, Eric, that this idea one can romanticize subaltern or ordinary life as a model, because when it reacts in very similar ways to how power reacts, apparently. And on the back of the conspiracy theory point you made, there's also the challenge of authoritarian populism, uncannily synchronized around the world. And the whole post-truth trope, you know, what is it? This kind of critical stance on expertise that I've voiced and the STEP Centre has for a long time articulated is challenged by that. If we want to claim progressive values and relevance. And so I don't know is the honest answer. I try and reflect on it, but I do think there's another there's another understanding here. This imagination of control, this overblown imagination control that I associated with globalizing modernity in all its diverse forms, this common thread expressed in the ways I tried to summarize in my little opening spiel. It's clear that is shared. I mean, these imaginations of control that go with the conspiracies are, as you say, ludicrous, but they're no more ludicrous than some of the imaginations going with, for instance, climate geoengineering or predicting the global temperature to 0.5 degrees in 2100. You know, these imaginations of control are shared. And when they're displayed by ordinary people, they become clearly visible to those thinking they're in the cockpit as pathological, but the other way around, it's less easy. So I think there's a shared syndrome there of overblown fantasies of control. But also there's a sense in which they may be provoked. It maybe is the overbearing expertise associated with the kind of, for instance, public health interventions that Melissa's looked at so much around the world, that often based far too much in ways Melissa's tried to challenge on assertion of this unique expertise, that there's no room for other kinds of knowledge of the kind Melissa's highlighted. That kind of overbearing expertise across different sectors as well provokes then a reaction. Well, no, we're not going to accept that. We don't believe that these things can be determined by expertise. And then you get this post-truth plague on experts reaction. So maybe it's a reaction, and maybe the uncanny synchronicity of this around the world is to do with this globalizing phenomenon that is shared between these different areas. So I'm not claiming that's actually the answer, but I think at least as potent as the hypothesis you embodied in your question is the alternative one that I just tried to put in. There's a lot of work to be done trying to get our heads around this. It's quite important.
Okay, great. So Sobia, do you want to respond to this? Do you want to respond to this one in particular?
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, thinking about suspicion and conspiracy as well. I mean, I think it's also, it's definitely a cultural reaction to different sort of forms of authority, and sort of it is based on sort of mistrust, where you have so many competing narratives that none of them make sense, and it's trying to kind of appropriate some kind of control over the over your own understanding of the matter, and sort of I definitely think that it's a projection, you could say, of your own it's a projection or a reaction to sort of not having enough trust in whatever structures are out there, but also in sort of making sense of it, in the best way that you can then manage and then live with. So it is emotional, like an intimate and personal sort of this projection of suspicion or conspiracy, or we don't believe this doesn't exist.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. And there's a comment now that's just coming into the chat, saying, this is from Pietro Gessi, who says, not sure of the link between uncertainty and conspiracy theories. Anti-vaxxers, anti-vaccination campaigners have been around since well before major uncertainties or populism, and I'm not sure this will be a bigger problem for COVID than it was for the MMR vaccine. I think in both, I mean, my view, having worked on both, is that in both cases, much as you said, Sobia, I think conspiracy theories often offer an alternative narrative of control. It just places the control with different people, different forms of power. And so you get these double narratives of control going on, this, as it were, this competition for control. But neither perhaps really gets to grips with the more multidimensional forms of uncertainty that might be possibly in play, as you're suggesting. But we've got another question here, which I think probably maybe is for Sobia in particular. So Kate Bloor is asking, how can good practice in community resilience in the time of a pandemic be enhanced by government at national or indeed local level? So I think that's really to say, if one's saying that there is a local level capacity to live with everyday ordinary uncertainties, how can that be supported and enhanced? So Sobia, would you like to comment there, perhaps from your perspectives?
Yes, I think it's interesting because this is something that I'm not sure if, I mean, there's two kinds of answers to them. One is kind of what kind of fixes that can the government put in place to enable that kind of community resilience, to allow it to emerge, what kind of platforms it can put in place. One of them was sort of, digital technologies was one of them that I mentioned. in allowing or creating platforms that that allow neighborhoods to come together to solve their own problems, to help some kind of local council / community partnership. And then these platforms can then become spaces to step in when problems happen. I mean, I'm just thinking in the current crises, some of these infrastructures already exist. Things like food banks, where people volunteer as well, but sort of communities also, councils also help. But I think what I'm interested in is perhaps the more cultural, the political cultural issue that ties to this. And again, it's kind of what kind of subjectivities are produced by governments in their trying to govern populations. And I find in these contexts, for example, I mean, as again, I'll speak to my experience of being Pakistani, but British in a way as well. It surprises me how detailed instructions are for people to act on by the government, and how they get very lost when those sort of instructions go missing. So things like in the hot summer, like every summer I hear in tube stations, be sure to carry water with you, make sure you drink water, or sort of these kinds of instructions that come from a place of sort of ensuring public good and health, but also they create a dependency, I guess, in people to have to follow these instructions, and then without that instruction, they're devoid of taking action. So I guess if there's something that can be thought of in kind of increasing confidence or public confidence, individual confidence in their own decision making. I mean, again, from a British perspective, not tied to uncertainty, but a little bit, like it's so striking how class matters. How some people are subjectified to order, like are made subject to government orders while others aren't. I'm thinking of a particular MP at the inquiry for Grenfell Towers on the policy of by the fire department to stay put, when he was questioned that whose fault is it that people didn't leave, or I forget what the exact question was, but he responded and said, if the building was burning down and I was asked to stay put, I would have used my common sense. And obviously, this is a very privileged person sitting in the House of Parliament, and him to say something like that, I mean, it shows something about how common sense, who's allowed to have common sense, who's been encouraged all their lives through their education, through their sort of privilege to be able to think like that they can deviate from an instruction that's given to them and follow common sense if it's for their own good. Yeah. So there's the politics, around the bigger issue of, how communities can be more enabled.
Great. So we've now got quite a few questions that have come in. So I'm going to read a set and then ask you perhaps to come back on the ones you'd like to answer, perhaps a little bit selectively, but we've got some great questions and comments coming in now. So Kurt Kirchhoff is saying, could you elaborate on the different levels of uncertainty? For example, uncertainty about staying alive versus uncertainty about having a stable internet connection. Okay, so that's sort of two very different sort of sets of implications, the seriousness of uncertainty. And then somebody anonymously is saying, what do you think the role of development is in this new time of uncertainty? Should we be looking to innovate to adapt to this environment in our programme, to take on that governance role where it might be lacking, or acknowledge the colonial connotations this could have and instead aim to move more towards an acceptance of ordinary uncertainty? So it's sort of what should development planners be doing? And then there's a question from Rima Bist from the Brilliant Club, who says she's intrigued by individual actions of self-interest versus a larger interest. For instance, not wearing masks, not maintaining social distancing rules. How much of these are mindset challenges or lack of knowledge or skills to understand how to deal with a pandemic as an uncertain situation? So that's kind of relationship between the individual and the collective in relation to uncertainty. And then there are two more, if you can keep with these. A question for both speakers from Vanessa Katsadi, who says, why do you think that even serious politics are so slow in taking into consideration all the warnings from scientists around the world? For example, taking care of public health care or measures against climate crisis. Okay. And then Corey Stedman asks, especially to Sobia, how do we address the risk of glorifying resilience of local communities over the emphasis on accountability, especially by governments, to everyday uncertainties in poorer communities? So I think that's a little bit, you've addressed that a little bit, but may want to expand. And then a final question, which is for both of you, about science and knowledge. So some academics say that COVID has become a question of social science as much as it is of traditional or natural science. How much does this change in viewing the pandemic affect the work done to reduce medical intervention? Okay, would you argue that this view helps or hinders it? Or you may have other things to say about the balance between social and medical science if we're to take uncertainty seriously. So that's quite a lot. So perhaps maybe Andy and then Sobia, could you kind of riff off the questions that you'd like to pick up on there?
Sure. So thanks. Yeah, I'll have a crack at, and actually it helps me with some of these really great questions to group them together. Actually, I think the question about levels of uncertainty, what about distinguishing magnitudes of what's at stake? The question about self-interest versus larger interest, the question about why politics has been slow to hear science, and the question about, is COVID social science as much as natural science? In a way, I group them all together at one level because I think they all reflect, good questions though they are, a kind of presumption, which is exactly the kind of presumption at the heart of this modernity imagination that I came up with. Because the whole point of uncertainty, for instance, is that it becomes indeterminate what the magnitudes are. So to discipline our understanding of uncertainty by a prior notion that there are in fact gradations of magnitude, and let's say assign it, of course there's very important reasons for doing that, but that's about risk. That's about where we've measured magnitude and we're confident in it. Uncertainty, precisely the uncomfortableness of it is that we're not confident in being able to do that. So it doesn't make sense to subordinate the problem to a framing that is itself neglecting the problem. And likewise then with the calculus of self-interest versus larger interest, which is of course central to vaccination governance, the point about uncertainty is it's under conditions of uncertainty. We don't actually know that. We know a lot, that's risk. Under uncertainty, if we're going to acknowledge it exists at all, we don't know for sure what are these trade-offs between self-interest and larger interest. So again, we can't subordinate that to the discipline that maybe is sometimes assumed. Why is politics slow to hear science? Again, that's when science is speaking robustly and confidently on the basis of, as it often does, of really well-grounded evidence, then that's of course a good question. But on other occasions, when science is over-egging the basis for what it's saying because the uncertainties, for whatever reason, have been neglected, as occurs in many environmental issues over the years, then actually it's a good idea for politics to be cautious about listening to science. It should take values seriously and take other interests seriously. And then finally, the COVID as social science point, and I realize I'm caricaturing the points here to be brief, but again, to draw out the same thread there, that yes, but let's not be surprised about that, because every single risk, every single scientific issue is in one sense as much a matter for social science as for science, because science is social. So social science is just looking out one end of the telescope at the phenomena out there. It's also looking at the other end of the telescope. Who's doing the looking? Because although it doesn't, and I say it out of a position of great respect for science, if you neglect that it is as pervaded by cultures and power structures as any other part of society, then you miss how extraordinarily potent science is at delivering robust knowledge, but it's not perfect. And if you miss those points, then you can easily be deceived by these structures in science to give us certain kinds of pictures. So, and that's being scientific about science. So it's not surprising to me that COVID, like every other issue looked at by science, is also a matter for social science in that sense, not just how to implement the policy, but where exactly did this policy come from in relation to the scientists themselves and their relations with government?
Okay. Wait a minute.
Yeah.
Great. Sobia, yeah. over to you for your take on these as well.
I think, yeah, I mean, I would echo a little bit on what Andy said, particularly because we had this sort of a little bit of this conversation before, didn't we, Andy? Before we talked about sort of the micro and the macro and how they intersect, how these particularly these sort of practices or ideas of how we look and live uncertainty at the ground level, even though it's very microismal, if that's the word. What relationship it has with grand narratives, and exactly, I think that the connections that link to everything. I mean, when one of the questions related to different levels of uncertainty, how an internet connection, uncertainty related to internet connection, how different is it to uncertainty related to death? But what if your internet connection relies on, like I said, in the case of Karachi, whether you can avoid death? I mean, I guess it's at the heart of it, and something that we're not able to go into well in this discussion is, the very idea of what uncertainty is. It's the idea that the future is indeterminable. But as well as at the same time, the politics of uncertainty is the fact that people try to think that they can make it governable by particular forms of knowledge, and this kind of what kinds of knowledges are then prioritized over others, or what kind of knowledges are thought of as truthful or scientific or rational, and all of these discussions feed into some of these questions as well. One other thing was self-interest versus larger interests around people wearing masks. I mean, if it's a lack of knowledge or if it's an attitude. I mean, again, as people, as individual actors who react in these situations, what we understand from everyday uncertainty is that everyone has a mechanism with which they're able to internalize whatever uncertainties or risks are out there, weigh them up in the balance of things, what they think based on their perception, based on their experience, but also their attitudes. So, which is why in something like this, you need some kind of regulatory environment where you have this now rule, I guess, that everybody needs to wear masks at a particular place. Now that we have seen that people are not responding or taking the initiative. I mean, in some cultures, mask wearing is very common. In East Asian culture, for example, even when people are traveling through airports, you'd see them wear masks. While in the US, people were up in arms about, why are we told to wear masks when, it's a violation of our right to liberty. So, yeah, I guess it's about cultures of knowledge, but also of individual ideas. But then that's why the regulatory environment is important in governing these kinds of uncertainties. And how do we resist glorifying resistance and encourage resilience and encouraging accountability at the same time? That's a very good question. I think it's particularly by putting them together, because in a lot of ways, at least in whatever academic, in the ways that debates around uncertainty and resilience are structured in academic discourse, you've got particular literatures, especially in development, where resilience is glorified, but then at the same time, there's very little discussion of what that means for what kind of politics might emerge, or what kind of government systems might be then created, generated. So it's about bringing these two streams of conversations together and talking about particularly the politics of this kind of knowledge creation around uncertainty. We are not saying that, in my talk, I'm not saying that the system actually works, because it does actually work, but I am actually saying that there are inequalities here that need to be managed, and you need some kind of regulation as well. So it's kind of finding a good middle. I'm afraid I can't think of anything pragmatic or practical right now, but up for more questions.
Okay. Excellent. So I think we've got time for just a few more. So there's one that I think really probably comes mostly to Sobia, from Sofia Garcia. So she says, Sobia, you talked about life in big cities and how uncertainty becomes certain in the daily lives of many people living in huge metropolises, especially in low-income countries. Would you say that as a result of this scenario or reality, it might be easier for people in those settings actually to underestimate the risks of coronavirus, or believe the conspiracy theories, perhaps the theories that say it doesn't exist, and so on? And she says she personally comes from Colombia, and is currently studying in Germany, and sees a difference, feels that somehow in Germany people are taking the crisis more seriously somehow, maybe in a comparative sense from the way they did back home. So be very interested in your comments on that. And then we've got a very interesting question from Robert Farnan from SEI York to both of you, who thanks you for your talks. And is moving towards the question of how we might be able to steer the politics of uncertainty towards something more progressive and more inclusive and equitable. He's wondering if you might reflect on the relationship between uncertainty and the concept of anxiety. Is there a relationship? And what implications does that have for what you're calling the politics of care? In other words, how might the subject orient him or herself towards uncertainties or the future in a way that avoids the politics of fear and the othering of non-citizens that so often has come to accompany populism? Mm-hmm. Perhaps more broadly, are there ethical lessons that we may be able to draw from non-linear science in order to avoid the politics of mastery that dominates our visions of modern politics? And then we've also just quickly got Rich Mallet coming in on the question of trust in authorities and the importance of trying to rebuild it. Why do we think it's been eroded in the first place? And to what extent might the failure of those in charge to acknowledge uncertainty and take responsibility when things go wrong come into it? So those are sort of a more specific question about sort of comparative experiences, and then two quite big ones about aspects of what we might call the politics of care and progressive politics. So I wonder if the two of you might pick up perhaps on those points, and just in view of time, then perhaps move towards a concluding remark, perhaps about the future and about what this more progressive politics could look like for COVID and beyond.
Thank you, Sophia, for your question. I really enjoyed it, particularly because it's also something that I've been experiencing and thinking of, like I said, with my family and friends in Pakistan, and myself sat here and thinking, you know, the attitudes are just so different. I mean, I think Colombia's political and social culture is very similar to Pakistan's at the moment, especially around the pandemic. Early on as well, it ties in really well with the earlier point we made on conspiracy theories and why people fall for them or believe them. A large number of people, a majority of people in Pakistan are precariously employed. Sort of they work in sort of as domestic workers, or low income wage sort of restaurant or stall holders or owners, or they rely on daily wage labor in order to be able to survive. So with a lockdown and with sort of complete closure sort of economic activities, they just wouldn't be able to survive, and they would really sort of be hurt, sort of financially, economically, and health-wise as well. So there's a lot of motivation to be able to take sort of that risk of going out and continuing with their work, and that sort of encouraging people that it's okay, it's fine, it's just a virus, just like any other virus. It's probably a conspiracy. They're just it's a Western conspiracy. We also hear that quite a bit. It's not real. And that kind of a conspiracy theory, again, is a way to manage or mitigate perhaps their own individual circumstances of precarity, where they feel like the situation is out of their control and they need to sort of continue making a living despite whatever sort of the repercussions might be. At the same time, I think that there is this, it's also a very deeply religious country. So, perhaps similar to sort of Karachi or the rest of Pakistan, perhaps similar to Colombia as well, where people do believe in fate and sort of believe in God and believe in sort of this idea of a higher authority and how whatever will happen, and there's a bigger protector, and this is just a man-made thing or something that's not sort of from God. And if we do well, so it's that kind of an idea as well. So yeah, I forgot what the real question was, but I think just thinking of comparison, it was just about the different ways in which people imagine risk is also because of the different ways in which of what's at stake. There's no social protection in Pakistan. There is social protection in Britain or in Germany, and if desperate times call for desperate imaginations or desperate rationalizations, let's just say, for people to sort of, give up the idea that this is a dangerous virus. I might have taken too much time on this, so I'll leave this other questions for Andy to answer.
Okay, fantastic. So Andy, you've got anxiety, trust, and a final word, perhaps.
Yes.
Picking up also on what Sobia said about what a progressive.
Yeah, no, great. And it does build on what Sobia, thanks Sobia, what you said then and what you said earlier as well in your really great talk. On anxiety, so it'll just be vignettes and it's just picking up threads, but it's a really great point about anxiety. We've been in the STEP Centre, various work we've been doing recently is making distinctions between kinds of transformative change. And a series of distinctions come out of that about the presumed way in which progressive change occurs through a transition with a vision and a leader and a cockpit with metrics. And we've contrasted then those kinds of things with transformation, a much more open type of process, driven by mutualism, by society at large, rather than by the so-called cockpit. And in that, there are a series of distinctions. They are in danger of being binaries, but between hope and fear, as you outlined, that actually it's a characteristic of the presumed processes that we live among, that they be fear-based. So it's not surprising there's always anxiety being engendered, rather than hope, which is a very unruly value for society to have. Hope, be careful about that if you're in power. Control and care, categories and relations, hierarchy, mutualism. These distinctions, anyway, we play with them a lot, and it's not the bottom line, but I think there's something there about these contrasting modes. So yes, anxiety it's a very powerful thing to convert that into hopes, a very potent, subversive thing. I just had a quick note of caution. We should be careful about caricaturing conspiracy theories. There is a symmetry I tried to just point to earlier, that the way the public are caricatured as being resistant to technologies, this sort of sound science, evidence-based assertions, which are clearly unscientific in their exaggeration of control, are and then when the resistance comes back, that is basically treated as a conspiracy. You guys are against us, you're irrational. So much of the trust debate is about trust of less powerful for more powerful. What about the trust of the more powerful for the less powerful? Trust is a reciprocal quality in society. It's essential, but reciprocally. And I hear it very one-sided. So I'm not surprised that the reaction looks like irrational conspiracy theories, when in fact it's quite an accurate diagnosis of a pathology of power. The details aren't right, but the basic structure is not so far wrong sometimes. Yeah. And then finally, how to steer. I can't presume to say that, but I would say one thing, and it comes from what Sobia has highlighted several times, equality. If knowledge is co-produced with social orders, they reflect each other, then actually we need look no further than science itself to see in the founding values of communitarianism, peer review, evidence, argument, that science is supposed to, and is very precious because it tries, but it doesn't ever fully succeed, to respect. Those are basically saying, if you want robust knowledge, have more equal relations. Where there are more equal relations, not only is there more of a capacity to respond to uncertainty, there's a greater understanding of uncertainty in the first place. And I think, thinking about social robustness, both in action and in knowledge, is one of the messages that for me comes out of this. And equality, equal societies have better understandings and are more robust. It's not just a social science enthusiasm, it's actually a message from science itself, I think.
Okay. Andy, that's a fantastic concluding point. And I would also just say, I think everything you've both said applies big time to development more generally, as a set of institutions and practices that are deeply imbued with power and have in their mainstream incarnation often very much been about techno-managerial control. And if one wants to think about this further, I would absolutely encourage everybody to read the book, The Politics of Uncertainty, but also just yesterday, a little bit of a plug for another publication, an article in World Development special issue on COVID-19 and development that I co-authored with Ian Scoones and others on post-pandemic transformations, why COVID-19 means we must rethink development. And this point about transformation and the politics of care and having equality as well as resilience at the center of a new politics of development is also something we argue for very, very strongly. So thank you enormously. It's been a really stimulating hour. Thank you to everybody who's posed questions. Sorry, we couldn't quite get to all of them. But that's there on the chat. We encourage you to follow up the conversation, perhaps on Twitter and listening to the recording, and invite everybody to join us then for the next in the series, which will be looking at how and why COVID-19 means we must think differently from a queer and feminist perspective, particularly with a focus on South Asia. And that will be coming up in the next couple of weeks. I think it's in 2 weeks' time. So thank you, everybody. And that's all for now. And all take care and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.